They thought she would stay home. They thought Evelyn Hart would sit alone in her apartment, crying over the wedding invitation that carried two names she never expected to see together, her ex-fiancé and her own sister. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought heartbreak would keep her hidden. But what they didn't know was this. 3. The woman they betrayed had once saved the daughter of the most feared mafia boss in the world. And when Evelyn walked into that wedding, she didn't come to beg, scream, or ruin the ceremony. She came dressed in black, standing beside Dante Moretti, the man powerful people feared to even mention out loud. Welcome to a channel built around mafia boss stories, where some men are born to dominate and some lessons can never be learned in school. This channel is not about crime. It is about mindset, courage, loyalty, discipline, and the hidden rules behind real power. Tonight's story teaches us that being strong does not mean suffering quietly. Sometimes, real strength is walking into the room they hoped you would never enter. If this story pulls you in, leave a like, comment where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs courage, and subscribe for more powerful mafia boss stories.
I didn't receive an apology. I received an invitation. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a water bill and a furniture catalog I never remembered subscribing to. The envelope was thick, ivory-colored, expensive in that quiet way rich families liked to pretend was tasteful instead of cruel. My name was written across the front in gold ink, not printed, handwritten. Whoever had addressed it had taken their time with every curve of every letter, as if beauty could soften what waited inside. I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a full minute before opening it. I already knew. Maybe not the details, not the date, not the venue, not the exact shade of betrayal they had chosen. But some part of me knew. Women always know before they know. We feel the floor shift. Notice the pause before someone says our name. We hear the truth hiding behind words like complicated and unexpected, and we never meant to hurt you. The card slid out smoothly, heavy paper, gold edges, white ribbon. Elegant enough to be displayed on a mantel in a house where nobody asked hard questions. Nathan Cole and Vanessa Hart request the honor of your presence at the celebration of their marriage. For a moment, the words did not become meaning. They were just shapes on paper. Nathan, Vanessa, marriage, my ex-fiancé, my younger sister, wedding. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because pain has a strange way of making you play it. It asks permission to enter before it destroys you. The date was what broke something loose in my chest, not the names. Not the golden lettering, the date. Because the wedding was only 3 weeks away, which meant this had not happened suddenly. This was not some reckless accident born from grief or confusion. They had chosen as a venue. They had hired a florist. They had tasted cake. They had written vows. They had made seating charts while my engagement ring was still sitting in the small velvet box Nathan had returned to me like it was a borrowed key. He had ended things 3 months earlier in a restaurant where the lighting was soft and the waiter knew not to come back too soon. Nathan had held my hand across the table and told me I was incredible, which is what men say when they are about to be cowards, politely. You deserve someone who is certain, he said. I remember staring at him, waiting for the rest. There is always a rest. Then he said, being with you feels like I am always trying to become something. Vanessa makes me feel like I already am. I didn't slap him. I didn't cry as in the restaurant. I didn't throw wine in his face. Although later I wished I had at least considered it. I just took my hand back and folded my napkin, because some women are trained so deeply in composure that even their heartbreak has manners. Now, standing in my apartment with their wedding invitation in my hand, I understood what he had really meant. Vanessa made him feel powerful because she needed him to be. Made him feel small because I had finally started to see him clearly. My phone was on the counter. I called my mother before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring. Evelyn? There it was. That careful tone. Not surprised. Not warm. Careful. You knew, I said. Silence. I looked down at the invitation again, my thumb pressed against the gold letters until the edge of the card dug into my skin. Mom, I said, quieter this time. Knew Nathan was marrying Vanessa, she sighed. Not the sigh of a mother whose daughter had just been wounded, the sigh of a woman inconvenienced by the fact that pain had arrived before dinner. Evelyn, sweetheart, it's not that simple. It never was, according to my family. Nothing that hurt me was ever simple. There was always context, always timing, always Vanessa's feelings, always someone else's fragile heart placed gently in my hands like I was born to carry it. When did you know? I asked. Another pause, that was the answer. I almost laughed, but it came out like a breath. Before he ended our engagement. Not before, she said quickly. Too quickly. Not exactly, the official language of betrayal. I walked to the kitchen table and set the invitation down like it might burn through the wood. Were you going to tell me? I thought it would be better if you heard it from them. They sent me an invitation, Mom. I know this is painful. No, I said. You know this is embarrassing, there's a difference. Her voice softened, which somehow made it worse. Maybe it would be better if you stayed home. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not comfort, not anger on my behalf, not even shame. Strategy. Stay home, Evelyn. Make it easier. Be mature. Be quiet. Be the strong one more time. I stared out the kitchen window at the city below. Chicago looked peaceful from 22 floors up. Lights in windows, cars sliding through traffic. People living private lives, unaware that mine had just been rearranged by people who claimed to love me. Better for me, I asked, or easier for everyone else? My mother did not answer. That silence was cleaner than any confession. I hung up first. For a long time, I stood there with the phone still in my hand. I did not cry. Not because I was fine, because sometimes pain arrives so fast that tears need time to catch up. I felt strangely hollow, like someone's had walked through the rooms of my life and removed every piece of furniture while I was out buying groceries. The apartment was too quiet. Nathan had helped choose this place. He had loved the windows, the view, the old brick wall in the dining area that I refused to cover, even though he said it made the room feel unfinished. I had told him unfinished things had character. He had smiled then, that warm attorney smile that made juries believe him, and women forgive him. Now, I wondered how many times he had stood in this apartment, texting my sister. I picked up the invitation again. Vanessa's name glittered under the kitchen light. My sister, when we were children, Vanessa used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. She would bring her stuffed rabbit, the one with the missing eye, and whisper, "Don't tell Moms I am scared, I never did." Move over, let her under the blanket, and stay awake until she fell asleep. That was my job before I knew. Jobs could be assigned without anyone saying it out loud. Vanessa was delicate. Evelyn was dependable, Vanessa cried. Evelyn understood. Vanessa needed. Evelyn handled. And now Vanessa was marrying the man I had planned a life with, and somehow I was still expected to protect the shape of her happiness. By 8 o'clock, the sky had gone dark. I had not eaten. The invitation remained on the table, open like a wound. My phone kept lighting up with messages I did not read. Cousins. An aunt. A family friend. People who had known before I did, now circling with soft words and sharp expectations. Then someone knocked on my door, not the buzzer from downstairs. A knock firm, controlled. 3 times. I froze. No one got to my floor without being cleared by the front desk. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood in the hallway, holding a black box tied with a silver ribbon. He did not look impatient. That made him more unsettling. I opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. "Miss Hart?" he asked. "Yes, this is for you, from who?" He held out the box, Mr. Moretti. The name meant nothing for half a second, then it meant too much. Dante Moretti. I had heard that name in whispers at charity galas and private client dinners. Men with expensive watches lowered their voices when they said it. Women pretended not to listen. He was not a celebrity, not a politician, not someone who needed public attention. He was the kind of powerful that lived behind other powerful people. I did not take the box right away. The man waited. Finally, I slid the chain free, opened the door, and accepted it. It was heavier than it looked. "Good night, Miss Hart," he said. Then he left. I closed the door and stood with my back against it, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. The box sat on my kitchen table beside the wedding invitation. black beside ivory, a warning beside an insult. Inside was a small silk scarf, freshly cleaned and folded with almost ceremonial care, pale blue, my scarf. 3 months earlier, during a power failure at the Langford Hotel, I had been trapped in an elevator with a little girl who was bleeding from one hand and trying very hard not to cry. I had wrapped that scarf around her palm, sat on the floor beside her, and told her to breathe with me until the emergency crew came. I had never known her last name. Under the scarf was a black card with silver lettering, Dante Moretti. On the back, written by hand, was one sentence: "A debt is never forgotten." My chest tightened. The wedding invitation suddenly felt different, not smaller exactly, but less final. For weeks, I had felt like everyone was arranging my absence. Like my pain was a problem to be managed from a distance. But this card, this scarf, this strange and dangerous reminder from a man I had never met, said something else. Someone had remembered what I did when nobody important was watching. The next morning, a black car waited outside my building. The driver stood beside it, hands folded, expression unreadable. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Moretti knows about the wedding. I should have been afraid." Maybe I was. But after being betrayed by people who called it love, fear no longer looked the way it used to. So I lifted my chin, stepped off the curb, and said, "Then I suppose he and I have something to discuss." The inside of the car smelled like leather, rain, and money that had never needed introduce itself. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded over my purse, trying not to look like a woman who had willingly stepped into a vehicle sent by a man people only spoke about after checking who was nearby. The driver did not ask where I wanted to go. He already knew. That should have frightened me more than it did. But fear is a strange thing after betrayal. Once the people closest to you have already proven they can hurt you with a smile, danger from strangers starts to feel almost honest. Chicago moved past the tinted windows in long gray strokes. Morning traffic crawled along Michigan Avenue. People carried coffee, checked phones, crossed streets without knowing that a woman in the back of a black car was trying to decide whether she had lost her mind. 24 hours earlier, I had been standing in my kitchen, holding an invitation to my ex-fiance's wedding to my sister. Now I was being driven to meet Dante Moretti, a man whose name carried the kind of silence people built around loaded guns. I had heard of him, of course, not directly. Men like Dante Moretti did not appear on magazine covers or give interviews about leadership and discipline. They existed in the pauses between conversations. A client once mentioned him at a charity dinner, then immediately changed the subject when his wife looked at him too sharply. Another man, a developer with a yacht and 3 divorces, had laughed too loudly after someone said Dante's name, as if fear could be disguised as amusement. I knew enough to understand that respectable people did business with him by pretending they did not. I also knew that if he wanted to harm me, he would not have sent a polite driver and a black box with my scarf inside. Still, I kept my phone in my hand. Not because I believed 911 would save me from a man like Dante Moretti, but because old habits of control are hard to surrender. I texted my assistant that I would be late. I almost texted my mother. Then I imagined her response. "Evelyn, what are you doing? Don't make this worse." Think of Vanessa. I locked the phone. The car stopped in front of the Langford Hotel, the same hotel where I had been trapped in the elevator 3 months earlier. My stomach tightened at the sight of it. I had not returned since that night. Back then, the lobby had been full of emergency lights, alarms, security guards pretending they had answers, and frightened guests wrapped in hotel blankets. Now it looked calm again, all marble floors and brass fixtures and flower arrangements so perfect they seemed artificial. That was the thing about expensive places. Healed over their disasters quickly. The driver opened my door. "Mr. Moretti is expecting you, Miss Hart." I gather that, I said. He did not smile, but something in his eyes suggested he appreciated the effort. We entered through a side door, not the grand lobby. A private elevator waited open, guarded by a man in a dark suit who looked at me once and then looked away. Not dismissively, carefully, like I was already marked as someone he had been instructed not to underestimate. That unsettled me more than being ignored would have. The elevator rose without stopping. I watched the numbers climb and tried not to remember the last time I had been inside one of these boxes. The lights had gone out. A child had screamed once, then clamped both hands over her mouth as if she had done something wrong. I had sat on the floor with her, used my scarf to wrap her bleeding palm, and told her to breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6. I had not known her name until the rescue crew arrived. Sophia. She had told me in a whisper, like her name was a secret. The elevator opened into a private floor that looked less like a hotel suite and more like a world removed from consequence. Wide windows, pale stone, dark wood, fresh flowers with no visible vase water. 2 men stood near the entrance. Both quiet, both armed in the way men are armed when they do not need you to see the weapon to know it exists. One of them nodded toward a set of double doors. This way I followed him into a room that overlooked the city. Chicago stretched beneath the windows in steel and glass, Lake Michigan flat and silver in the distance. For a moment, the view stole my attention. Then the man by the window turned around. Dante Moretti was not what I expected. I do not know what I had imagined. Maybe someone larger, louder. The kind of man who filled a room by trying to dominate it. But Dante stood still, one hand in the pocket of a black suit, the other resting lightly against the back of a chair. His hair was dark with silver at the temples. His face was handsome in a severe way, not polished, not soft, marked by time and restraint. He had the kind of eyes that did not scan a person. They settled. As if he had already removed every unnecessary detail and was waiting for the truth to step forward. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was low, calm. No accent thick enough to turn him into a character from someone else's imaginations. Just a man used to being heard the first time. "Mr. Moody, thank you for coming." I wasn't sure I had a choice. That made one of the men near the door shift slightly. "Daunt, did not you had a choice," he said. "If you had refused, the car would have left. Forgive me if I don't know the etiquette for being summoned by a mafia boss." The room went still. I heard my own words after I said them, and wondered whether heartbreak had made me reckless. But Dan did not look offended. If anything, something almost like amusement touched his face and disappeared before it could become a smile. "Most people pretend they don't know what I am," he said. "I've had enough pretending this week." His gaze held mine for a second longer than comfort allowed. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, please. I'd rather stand, as you like." He did not insist. That was the first thing I noticed. Men who liked control usually revealed themselves in small denials. "Sit here. Drink this. Calm down. Don't be dramatic." Dante gave the option once, accepted my refusal, and moved on. It did not make him less dangerous, it made him harder to read. A door opened at the far end of the room. A woman in her 60s entered, carrying a tray with coffee and water. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly, her posture straight enough to make the room seem slightly less intimidating. Set the tray down without looking at Dante for permission, which told me she was either very trusted or very brave. "Thank you, Clara," Dante said. She glanced at me, not unkindly. "Coffee, Miss Hart?" "No, thank you. You should have coffee," she said. "You look like someone who forgot breakfast." I blinked. Dante's mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "I am fine," I said, because that was what I always said when I was not. Clara poured a cup anyway and placed it near the chair I had refused. Then she left as quietly as she had entered. Dante looked toward the coffee. "Clara has ignored more dangerous people than you." Despite myself, I sat. The coffee was black, strong, and annoyingly perfect. Dante remained standing. "My daughter told me you were calm." "I wasn't calm. She said you were." Children mistake useful behavior for courage. They also recognize kindness before adults do. That silenced me. I turned slightly toward the window, but I had the sense he was not looking at the view. Sophia had not spoken to a stranger in almost a year before that night. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the heat bite into my palms. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't." There was weight in the way he said it, not recognition. "She was hurt," I said. "She was scared. I did what anyone should have done. Many people do not do what they should." I thought of my mother as silence, Nathan as careful restaurant speech, Vanessa's name printed in gold beside his. "No," I said. "They didn't tet." Dante finally sat across from me. He moved with the patience of someone who had never needed to hurry for another person's comfort. "Sophia, Remembers your exact words, he said. I swallowed. What words? You told her, if you scared, hold my hand. I'll be scared with you, but I want to leave you alone. The room blurred slightly at the edges. I remembered saying it. At the time, I had been sitting in the dark with a child bleeding into my scarf while the emergency speaker crackled above us. I had said whatever I needed to say to keep her breathing steady. I had not known those words had followed her home. She spoke that night, Dant said to the paramedic first. Then to me, his voice did not change, but something beneath it. Did a fracture under ice for that, he continued. I owe you. I don't want money. I didn't offer money. I don't want anything illegal either. This time he did smile faintly. You were direct. I am tired that too. I looked away first, irritated by how easily he said it. Why did you send the scarf? Because I wanted you to know this meeting was about my daughter, before you decided it was about fear. And is it fear? He considered the question. Not from me, not toward you. It was a strange answer, precise, controlled. I set the coffee down. Then why am I here? Dant leaned back slightly. Because you received a wedding invitation yesterday. Every muscle in my body tightened. I did not ask how he knew, that seemed pointless. Instead, I said, is this where you tell me you know everything about me? No, I know enough. Enough for what? To understand that your family expects you to disappear. The words landed too cleanly. I looked at the windows because looking at him felt suddenly impossible. My family wants peace. No, Dante said. Want silence. People often confuse the two when they are not the ones being asked to bleed quietly. I hated that he was right. I hated that a man with his reputation had named my pain more honestly than my own mother had. Nathan Cole was my fiancé, I said, though I did not know why. Maybe because saying it plainly was the only way to prove it had been real. 7 years we were together, 7 years. He ended it 3 months ago. Then yesterday I find out he is marrying my sister, Fasa. Hearing her name in his voice made the whole thing feel colder. You investigated me. I protect what matters to my daughter. I am not what matters to your daughter. You were. For 40 minutes in an elevator. Sometimes that is enough. I had no answer for that. Daunt rested his hands on the arms of the chair. He wore no rings except a plain wedding band on his left hand. That detail caught me. Years after his wife's death, if the whispers were true, and he still wore it. Not for show. Men like him did not need symbols unless they were private. What do you want, Miss Hart? He asked. The question was so simple that I almost laughed. What did I want? I wanted Nathan to feel what I felt when I opened that invitation. I wanted Vanessa to understand that being chosen by a man who betrayed me was not victory. I wanted my mother to look me in the eye and admit she had protected the wrong daughter for the wrong reasons. I wanted 7 years of my life returned unspoiled. I wanted to stop picturing their wedding cake, their first dance, their smiles preserved in photographs while I became the sad story everyone avoided mentioning at Thanksgiving. But underneath all that, there was something smaller, cleaner, more honest. I want to walk into that wedding, I said slowly, without everyone looking at me like I was thrown away. Dante watched me. Forced myself to continue. I don't want to beg. I don't want to scream. I don't want to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. I just want to stand there and not feel abandoned. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, then do not enter as someone abandoned. I looked at him. Enter as someone escorted. The meaning settled between us. No, I said immediately. Daunt did not react. No, I am not hiring you to play my date. I did not offer to play anything. I am not using a dangerous man to make my ex jealous. If jealousy were your goal, you would have asked for someone prettier and less inconvenient. I stared at him. He looked completely serious against every instinct I had. I almost smiled. That was almost a joke, I said. Almost. The brief lightness vanished as quickly as it came. Would you do that? I asked. Walk into my family's disaster with me? Because I owe you. That seems extreme for an elevator. My daughter's voice is not an elevator. The answer struck me quiet. Dante leaned forward slightly, and the air shifted with him. Listen carefully, Miss Hart. I will not pretend to love you. I will not touch you for performance. I will not make you a spectacle. If you choose to attend that wedding, I will walk beside you, sit beside you, and leave when you decide to leave. Anyone who mistakes your dignity for weakness will correct that mistake privately. A chill ran through me, not because he threatened violence. He did not. That was almost worse. Dante Moretti spoke as if consequences were weather systems he could arrange. And what do you get? I asked. Eyes moved toward the city again. There are names on that guest list that interest me. Richard Vale. He looked back at me. I remembered the name from the invitation insert. Major donors. Honored guests. Richard Vale. Billionaire real estate investor, family friend of the groom. What does he have to do with me? I asked. Perhaps nothing yet. Yet? Your sister's wedding is not only a wedding. I felt the coffee turn bitter in my stomach. What is it? Dante's voice remained calm. A room where certain men believe women are signatures, inheritances, and doors. The phrase unsettled me more than I wanted it to. My family doesn't have that kind of power, I said. Your family has land, trusts, historic properties, development rights. Your mother has influence she does not understand. Your sister has access she has never had to earn. And Nathan Cole is a man who has spent years studying how to enter locked rooms without breaking the door. I thought of Nathan's career, his ambition, the way he always knew exactly who to flatter at dinner. I thought of Vanessa, soft and eager to be adored. I thought of my mother, who still believed good manners could protect a family from predators. You think Nathan is using Vanessa, I said. I think men like Nathan rarely choose without calculating. The sentence should have hurt. It did, but not in the way I expected. It confirmed something I had been trying not to know. And you? I asked. Do you choose without calculating? No. At least he did not lie. Dante stood and walked to a side table. He picked up a cream envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a copy of the wedding invitations, the full guest list, and a photograph clipped to the back. Richard Vale stood beside Nathan at what looked like a private club. They were smiling. Nathan's hand rested lightly on a folder. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because if you walk into that wedding with me, you should understand that the room may become more honest than your family intended. I looked at the photograph again. Nathan's smile was the same one he had worn when he told me I deserved someone certain. Suddenly, I understood that my heartbreak might not be the center of the story. It was the door. Dante watched me carefully. You can still say no. I believed him. That surprised me. If I say no, my driver takes you home. I will make sure no one from my world approaches you again. And the wedding? That remains yours to attend or avoid. I held the envelope in both hands. Most of my life, people had made decisions around me and then asked me to be graceful about the consequences. My mother, Vanessa, Nathan. Even well-meaning friends who told me I was too strong to fall apart. Dante Moretti, of all people, was giving me a choice without dressing it as advice. That did not make him safe, but it made him honest. I stood. I need time. You have until tomorrow evening. That's not much time. Weddings are rarely considerate. I gave him a look. This time, he almost smiled again. At the door, I stopped. Mr. Mordes? Miss Vite, if I go with you, I decide when we leave. Yes, I speak for myself. Yes. And you didn't turn my pain into some kind of performance. His expression changed then. Only slightly, but enough. No, he said. I know what it is to have grief turned into other people's theater. For the first time since I had entered the room, I saw not the mafia boss, not the whispered name, not the dangerous man in the perfect suit. I saw a widower who still wore his ring and a father whose daughter had needed a stranger's hand in the dark. I nodded once and left before I could say anything too human. The driver was waiting by the elevator. As I stepped inside, my phone buzzed a message from Vanessa. Please don't to come. Just let me have this one thing. The elevator doors began to close. I looked at the message until the words blurred into something almost funny. Let me have this one thing, as if she had not already taken it. As if what hurt me most was the wedding itself, and not the expectation that I would politely disappear from it. I typed slowly. You already took it. I am only coming to see what you did with it. Then I hit send. For the first time since the invitation arrived, my hands were not shaking. By the time I got back to my apartment, the city looked exactly the same, which felt insulting. People were still rushing through crosswalks with coffee in one hand and phones in the other. Buses still hissed at the curb. The doorman still said, "Good afternoon." like my life had not quietly split itself into before and after. I stepped to the elevator with the envelope Daunt Moretti had given me pressed against my ribs. And for the first time since Nathan's invitations arrived, I understood that my humiliation had never belonged only to me. Other people had built plans around it. Other people had made calculations, written checks, arranged flowers, and assumed I would be too wounded to walk into the room and see what they had done. Inside my apartment, the wedding invitation still sat on the kitchen table. I left it open, Nathan and Vanessa's names facing the ceiling like they were proud of themselves. I placed Dante's envelope beside it and stood there for a long moment, looking at both pieces of paper. One had been sent to remind me I had been replaced, the other had been given to remind me I had a choice. That was the difference between cruelty and power, I thought. Cruelty needed use, Mosal. Real power did not. My phone started buzzing before I could take off my coat. Aunt Caroline first, then my cousin Beth, then a number I did not recognize, which meant someone had probably decided to lend my grief to a group. Chat, I ignored the calls. The messages came anyway. Evelyn, honey, I know this is hard, but please don't make the wedding uncomfortable. Mother is worried about you. Vanessa has been crying all morning. Nathan feels awful too, you know. That one made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because if I did not laugh, I might have thrown my phone across the room. Nathan felt awful. How generous of him. How noble. The man had left me, moved himself into my sister's future, helped plan a wedding behind my back, and now his discomfort was being passed around like a family emergency. Nobody asked if I had eaten. Nobody asked if I had slept. Nobody asked what it felt like to be invited to watch the two people who had betrayed me smile in front of everyone we knew. They only asked me to be careful with the feelings of the people holding the knife. I opened Dante's envelope again. The guest list was longer than I expected. Politicians, judges, real estate developers, lawyers, foundation board members, people who wore charity like perfume and treated privacy like currency. Richard Vale's name appeared near the top, bold and important, listed as an honored guest. I stared at it until I could almost hear Dante's voice again. A room where certain men believe women are signatures, inheritances, and doors. I did not fully understand what he meant yet, but I understood enough to feel cold. That evening, I poured myself a glass of water and tried to make dinner. I opened the refrigerator, stared at a container of leftover pasta, and closed it again. I've had a way of making the simplest tasks feel theatrical. Cut the vegetables, heat the pan, pretend the bodice still knew what normal was. I gave up and sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets. The same way I used to sit when I was a little girl hiding from my parents' arguments. When Vanessa and I were young, I was always the one sent to check on her. If thunder scared her, I went to her room. If she cried at school, I was told to walk her home. If she broke something, I was asked to explain it gently so she would not feel worse. My mother called it sisterly love. Maybe it was, at first. But love becomes something else when only one person is expected to practice it. The next morning, Dante's stylist arrived exactly at 9. Her name was Marissa Blake. She was in her 40s, with sharp cheekbones, soft blonde waves, and the kind of calm confidence women earn after years of watching rich people panic about fabric. Behind her came two assistants carrying garment bags. They filled my living room with dresses in deep red, champagne, emerald, silver, and midnight blue. Every gown was beautiful. Every gown looked like it belonged to a woman walking into a room to be seen. Marissa studied me without being rude. Mr. Moretti said you would choose for yourself. That sounds like him. You know him well? No, she smiled faintly. Then you already know him better than most. I ran my fingers over a red gown with a low back and a dangerous kind of elegance. It was exactly what people expected from a woman going to her ex-wedding. Revenge in silk. A headline disguised as clothing. For a second, I imagined walking and wearing it. I imagined Vanessa's face, Ethan's regret, the room whispering that I looked stunning. Then I imagined what would come after. They would reduce me to the dress, to jealousy, to performance. They would say I came for attention. I stepped away from the red gown. What do you want them to feel? Marissa asked. I looked at her. I don't want them to feel anything. That's not usually the answer. I know. Then what do you want? I turned toward a black dress hanging at the far end of the rack. It was simple, long, elegant. High neckline, clean shoulders, a narrow waist. Nothing desperate about it. It did not beg the room to look. It simply assumed the room would. That one, I said. Marissa's expression changed with approval. You don't want them to regret losing you. I took the hanger from her hand. No, I want them to understand they never owned me. She did not answer right away. Then she nodded once. Like that was the first honest thing she had heard all morning. Later that afternoon, Dante called, not texted, called. His name appeared on my screen, and for a moment I simply watched it ring. There was something unsettling about seeing the name that made powerful men lower their voices glowing casually on my phone. Answered. Mr. Moretti, Miss Hart, you always sound like you re-standing in a room where everyone else has already made a mistake. I usually am. I hated that I almost smiled. The dress has been chosen? He asked. Yes, good. You don't want to know what it looks like? No, that surprised me. No, you are not dressing for me. A quiet settled over the line. I had not realized how often men made women's choices feel like auditions until one simply refused to judge mine. Dante continued, tomorrow evening we will discuss the wedding. Discuss it, how to enter, where to sit, what to answer, what not to answer. I know how to attend a wedding. You know how to attend a wedding where people love you. This is just the truth of that stung. He was right. I had been to weddings where people hugged in hallways and cried during vows and drank too much champagne because happiness made them reckless. This was not that, this was a stage, and I had been cast as the woman who was supposed to stay home that night. Vanessa texted again. I know you were angry, but if you come, everyone will be watching you. Instead of me, please, Evelyn, for once. Let me have something without making it about you. I stared at the words until my eyes burned, for once. That was the genius of Vanessa. She could take the man I was supposed to marry and still make herself sound like the one being denied. My first instinct was to type something cruel. I wanted to say everything. I wanted to remind her of every birthday I had stepped aside, every apology I had been forced to offer first, every time Mom had chosen her tears over my truth. But Dante's voice came back to me, calm and irritatingly useful. Do not answer the question they ask. Answer the reason they asked it. Vanessa was not asking me to stay home because she was fragile. She was asking me to stay home because my presence would make her victory feel less clean. So I typed only one sentence. If my presence ruins your happiness, maybe I am not the problem. I sent it before I could soften it. The next day, I met Sophia. Dante did not prepare me for that. His driver brought me to the same hotel, but instead of taking me upstairs to the private floor, he led me to a quiet garden terrace closed off from the public. The city noise was softer there. Planters overflowed with white flowers. A fountain moved gently in the corner. Sophia sat at a small table with a sketchbook in front of her. She was 10, maybe a little small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a ribbon and serious eyes that made her look older than any child should. When she saw me, she stood. You came, she said. Her voice was soft but steady. I felt something in my chest loosen. I did. She looked at my hand. Do you still have the scarf? Your father sent it back to me. I told him to. That was kind of you. She shrugged slightly, as if kindness embarrassed her. It was yours. Dantain stood a few feet away, not interrupting. He watched his daughter with a stillness I could not quite name, not control, not distance, fear maybe. Careful fear of a man who had already lost too much and did not trust the world to stop taking. Sophia picked up the folded scarf from the table and held it out to me. I washed it again. I took it gently. Thank you. She studied my face. Are you going somewhere scary? I thought about lying. Adults lied to children constantly and called it protection. But I remembered what I had told her in the elevator. Fear was easier to carry when someone admitted it was real. A little, I said. Are they bad people? I looked toward the city beyond the terrace. Somewhere my sis was preparing to marry the man who had broken me politely. My mother was probably telling herself peace required sacrifice. As long as I was the one being sacrificed. Not everyone who hurts you thinks they bad, I said. That is why you have to watch what people do, not only what they say. Sophia nodded slowly. Father says that. Your father seems to say a lot with very few words. For the first time, Sophia smiled. Dante's face changed when she did. It was quick, almost hidden, but I saw it. The most feared man in the world looked, for 1 second, like any father grateful his child had found a reason to smile. And that was when I understood something important about Dante Moretti. He was dangerous, yes, maybe more dangerous than anyone I had ever met. But danger was not the only thing living in him. There was loyalty there. Grief, a kind of love so guarded it had become almost invisible. The evening before the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror wearing the black dress. It fit perfectly, not like armor. Truth. My phone buzzed one final time. A message from my mother. Please think it carefully about tomorrow. Once you walk into that room, you can undo it. I looked at myself in the mirror. For 32 years, I had been careful. Careful with Vanessa, careful with Mom, careful with Nathan as pride, careful with everyone as comfort, except my own. I typed back, I know, that's why I am coming. Then I set the phone down. Tomorrow, I would walk into the room they had built around my absence, and I would not walk in alone. The morning of the wedding, I woke before my alarm. For a few seconds, I did not remember what day it was. There was only the gray light coming through my bedroom curtains, the low hum of the city below, and the strange weight in my chest that had become familiar over the past week. Then I turned my head and saw the black dress hanging on the closet door. That was when everything came back. Nathan, Vanessa, the invitation, my mother's silence, Dante Moretti's offer. The room I was supposed to be too broken to enter. I lay there for another minute, staring at the ceiling, waiting for fear to talk me out of it. It tried, of course it tried. Fear sounded like my mother. It told me I could still choose peace. It told me staying home would make me look mature. It told me people would stare, whisper, judge my dress, judge my face, judge whether I looked too calm or not calm enough. It told me Nathan would think I came because I still loved him. It told me Vanessa would cry and somehow make herself the injured one. Fear had many voices that morning, but beneath them all, there was one quiet truth that did not move. If I stayed home, they would get to tell the story without me in the room, so I got up. I showered slowly, did my hair myself, and kept my makeup simple. No red lipstick. No dramatic eyes. Nothing that looked like I had painted my pain into a costume. When I stepped into the black dress, it felt different than I expected. I thought it would feel like armor, but it didn't. Armor is heavy. This felt clean. Like I had finally stopped dressing for the comfort of people who had never protected mine. At 10:30, my phone buzzed, a message from my mother. Evelyn, please, if you are coming, don't make this harder than it already is. I looked at the message for a long time, not because I needed to answer, but because I wanted to understand how Emma could look at her daughter, Cec's humiliation, and still ask her to manage the room. I typed nothing. I set the phone face down on the vanity and fastened my earrings. At 11, the black car arrived. Dante was inside. I had expected him to send a driver and meet me at the estate. Instead, he sat in the back seat, dressed in a black suit, white shirt, no tie. He looked like a man attending neither a wedding nor a funeral, but something closer to judgment. His eyes moved over my face once, not in the way men usually look at women, not measuring beauty or approval. He was checking for cracks. Miss Hart, he said. Mr. Murty, you're certain? I almost laughed. That's a generous question to ask when your car is already here. The car can leave in either direction. There it was again, choice. Simple, clean, and unsettling because I was not used to it. I looked toward the street, toward the city. I knew, toward the building, where I could still go back upstairs, take off the dress, close the curtains, and become exactly what they expected. Then I opened the car door wider and got in. I'm certain. Dante gave one small nod to the driver. The car pulled away from the curb. The wedding was being held at a private estate on Lake Michigan, north of the city. The kind of place old money rented when it wanted new money to feel grateful. The drive took less than an hour, but it felt longer. I watched the buildings thin out, the lake appearing and disappearing between trees and iron gates. Dante did not fill the silence. I appreciated that. Some people talk when they are uncomfortable. Dante seemed to understand that silence could be a form of respect. 10 minutes before we arrived, he spoke. They signed the marriage license this morning. My head turned sharply. What? Nathan and Vanessa? The legal marriage happened at 9:15. The ceremony today is for the guests. For a moment, I could not breathe properly of all the things I had prepared myself for. That was not one of them. I had imagined walking into a wedding that had not yet happened, a betrayal still waiting at the altar, but it was already done. My ex-fiancé had not simply chosen my sister, he had already married her before I even left my apartment. I looked down at my hands, they were still that surprised me. I see, I said. Dante watched me carefully. Do you want to turn back? No. The word came faster than I expected. Something had shifted inside me. The legal fact of it should have broken me more, but instead it burned away the last thin thread of uncertainty. There was no misunderstanding left, no final conversation. No secret hope that Nathan might look at me and remember who we had been. He had crossed the line completely. So had Vanessa. So had my mother by helping them make it easier. I lifted my chin. Now I definitely need to be there. Dante's mouth almost softened. I thought you might say that. The estate came into view behind a long stone wall and a set of black iron gates. White flowers curled over the entrance. Valet moved quickly across the circular driveway. Guests in pale dresses and expensive suits stood near the front steps, laughing with champagne flutes in their hands. From outside, it looked perfect. It was the first lie. The moment our car stopped, people began to look. At first, I thought they were looking at the car. Then the driver opened Dante's door, and I felt the air change. It was not dramatic. No one gasped loudly. No one shouted his name. But conversations thinned. Smiles paused. A man near the fountain lowered his glass without drinking. Another turned away too quickly, as if eye contact with Dante Moretti could become a contract he had not meant to sign. Dante stepped out first. He did not hurry, he did not scan the crowd like he needed approval. He simply stood, adjusted one cuff, then turned and offered me his hand. For half a second, I stared at it. Taking his hand would become a photograph in someone's mind, maybe in someone's phone. Maybe in a whisper that would spread before we reached the doors. Then I remembered what he had said. Enter as someone escorted, not abandoned. I placed my hand in his. The murmurs started before my shoes touched the stone driveway. I heard my name first, then his, then silence again. We walked up the steps together. At the entrance, Aunt Caroline saw me and went pale in that theatrical way people do when they have rehearsed sympathy but not surprise. Evelyn, she said, touching her pearls. Oh, you came. It was fascinating how many people said that sentence as if I had risen from the dead instead of accepted an invitation. I did, I said. Her eyes flicked to Dante. And your guest? Dante looked at her. That was all. Just looked. Aunt Caroline stepped back. Inside, the estate had been transformed into a soft, white fantasy. White roses, white candles, white silk draped along the staircase. A string quartet played somewhere beyond the main hall. Everything was delicate, expensive, and false. The kind of beautiful that asked you not to look too closely at what it was covering. People noticed us in waves. First, the guests near the entrance, then the ones near the bar, then the rows of chairs facing the floral arch, where Vanessa would stand in white and pretend purity was something you could wear. A judge I recognized from one of Nathan's firm events looked directly at Dante, then immediately looked away. A city councilman whispered something to his wife and left his champagne untouched. One of Richard Vale's men, a thick-necked man in a navy suit, reached for his phone, then stopped when Dante's eyes moved in his direction. No one said that's Dante Moretti, they did not have to. Fear has its own etiquette. Then I saw Nathan. He stood near the front of the room, one hand resting against the back of a chair, laughing at something one of his groomsmen had said. He looked handsome. I hated that I noticed. Navy suit, perfect haircut, easy smile. The face of a man who had already survived his worst behavior because the woman he hurt was supposed to stay home. Then his eyes found mine. The smile vanished. For one small honest second, Nathan looked exactly like a man who had opened a door and found the wrong future nesting on the other side. Vanessa stood beside him in her wedding gown. She was beautiful. Of course she was. My sister had always been beautiful in a way that made people want to forgive her before she asked. Her dress was lace and pearls and soft sleeves, the kind of gown little girls point at in magazines. Bouquet trembled when she saw me. Then she saw Dante. Her face changed from shock to confusion to something close to fear. Good, I thought, and then felt tired of the thought immediately. I did not want to become the kind of woman who lived for that expression. I wanted only to stop being the woman who disappeared to avoid causing it. My mother appeared from the side aisle. Margaret Hart was dressed in pale blue. Elegant and composed, her silver blonde hair swept back perfectly. She looked like a mother of the bride from a charity magazine. Then she saw me, and the composure cracked around her mouth. "Evelyn," she said softly, "I didn't think you to come." "I know," I said. "Most people here din a few nearby." Guests stopped pretending not to listen. My mother's gaze moved to Dant. Held out her hand automatically because manners had always been her favorite shield. "And this is?" Dante took her hand. His expression remained polite, but the room seemed to lean away from him. "Dante Moretti," he said. "I'm here with Evelyn. Not for me, not over me, with me." The difference was small enough that some people might have missed it. I did not. My mother's fingers tightened once before he released her hand. "I see," she said, though clearly she did not. From the front of the room, Nathan started toward us. Vanessa caught his sleeve, but he pulled free. His face recovered some of its color, but not enough. He looked at me first, then Dante, then my hand resting lightly on Dante's arm. "Evelyn," Nathan said, forcing a smile. "This is unexpected." I looked at him, the man I had once planned to marry. The man who had legally married my sister that morning. The man who thought my absence would be his final convenience. "Yes," I said, "I imagine it is." Dante stood beside me, silent. And for the first time in my life, I did not explain myself to anyone. Nathan stood in front of me wearing the careful smile he used for judges, clients, and women he had already decided to lie to. Up close, he looked almost the same as he always had. Same clean shave. Same expensive cologne. Same blue eyes that used to soften when he wanted forgiveness before he earned it. But something about him had changed, or maybe something about me had. I could see the strain at the corner of his mouth. I could see the quick flick of his eyes toward Dante, then back to me, as if he were trying to decide whether this was a social problem or a dangerous one. "Evelyn," he said again, softer this time. "Can we talk?" My mother inhaled like she wanted to object, but Dante's silence seemed to close her mouth for her. That was the strange thing about him. He did not need to interrupt. He simply stood there, and people began making better decisions. I looked at Nathan. We were talking. Now his smile tightened privately there. As nothing private left between us, Nathan. A few guests nearby pretended to admire the flowers. No one moved away. People always claim they dislike drama, but most of them will stand very still to hear it clearly. Nathan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "What are you doing?" I tilted my head. "Attending your wedding. I was invited." "You know what I mean." "No," I said. "I really don't. You sent me an invitation. My mother asked me not to come. Vanessa begged me to stay home, and now you were surprised to Nard. Up here, which part of that would you like me to explain back to you?" His jaw flexed. For a second, I saw the man beneath the polished suit. Not heartbroken, not guilty. Annoyed, that hurt more than I expected. He was not devastated by what he had done. He was irritated that I had complicated it. "You brought him here to make me jealous?" Nathan asked. The words came out quiet but ugly, as if the only possible reason for my presence was still him. I looked past him at the white roses, the gold chairs, the guests watching without watching. Then I looked back at the man I had once planned to marry. "Nathan," I said, "if I wanted to make you jealous, I would have brought someone you could compete with." For one beautiful, terrible second, he had no answer. Dante did not smile. He did not need to. His stillness was worse than laughter. Nathan Ent's eyes hardened. "You always did know how to make yourself sound superior." "No," I said. "I just finally stopped making myself smaller so you could feel tall." That landed. I saw it. Not because he was ashamed, but because he recognized the truth and hated me for saying it where someone might hear. He stepped back, smoothing the front of his jacket as if dignity were something a man could adjust with his cuffs. Before he could speak again, Vanessa appeared beside him. My sister looked breathtaking in her wedding gown. Lace sleeves, pearl buttons, saw a soft veil pinned into her blonde hair. She had always been beautiful in a way that made people protective before she said a word. When she was a child, That beauty made strangers smile at her in grocery stores. When she was a teenager, it made teachers forget flight assignments. As a woman, it had taught her that tears could be a language if she used them carefully enough. Evelyn, she whispered. I turned to her, Vanessa's. Her eyes were bright, but not with happiness. Can we please not do this here? That is interesting, I said, because here is exactly where you chose to do it. Nathan touched her arm. Vanessa, Dawn T. She pulled away from him, and for the first time that day, I saw a crack in the perfect bride. I asked you not to come. I know. Then why are you here? The question should have been simple. It was not. I looked at my sister and saw every version of her at once. The little girl crawling into my bed during storms. The teenager borrowing my clothes and never returning them. The woman who had smiled too brightly when Nathan came to family dinners. The bride standing in front of me now, acting as if my presence were the injury. Because you wanted the reward, I said quietly, without the witness. Her face flushed. That S not fair. No, it is T. But it's S honest. Her eyes flicked toward Dante. And him? What is this? Some kind of revenge? Dante's voice entered the conversation for the first time, calm. Oh, enough to still the air around us. I am not revenge, Mrs. Cole. Vanessa went pale at the name. Mrs. Cole, there it was, the legal truth. The marriage had already happened that morning. The ceremony was for the guests, for the photographs, for the story they wanted to tell. But on paper, my sister was already Nathan's wife. The words hit me again, but softer this time. Not because they hurt less, because I was standing. Vanessa swallowed. You don't know anything about our family. Dante looked at her with a kind of polite disinterest that was somehow more brutal than contempt. I know enough to recognize when a room has been arranged around one woman as silence. Nobody spoke. Then my mother stepped forward, her smile trembling under the weight of witnesses. Maybe we should all take a breath. This is a special day. I looked at her. For whom? Her face tightened. Evelyn. There it was again. My name is warning. My name is correction. My name is a hand pressing down on my shoulder. But before she could say more, a wedding coordinator approached with a headset and a terrified expression. Mrs. Hart? They re-ready to begin the reception seating. My mother glanced between us, calculating damage. She did what Margaret Hart always did when emotions became too honest. She chose appearances. Yes, she said too brightly. Of course. Everyone, let's move inside. The reception hall was even more beautiful than the ceremony space. Tall windows facing the lake, crystal glasses, white linens, candles floating in clear bowls. A tiered cake stood near the far wall, decorated with sugar flowers, so delicate they looked ashamed to be part of this. At the head table, Nathan and Vanessa sat side by side beneath a garland of white roses. My mother sat nearby, smiling at guests, as if her daughters were not breaking in two different ways. Dante and I were seated at a table near the center. That was not where they had planned to put me. I knew because my place card had clearly been moved. Someone had decided, at the last minute, that hiding me in a corner would look worse. Now that I had arrived with a man no one wanted to offend. Dante pulled out my chair. Not dramatically, not possessively. Just enough courtesy to remind the room that I was not an inconvenience. I sat. Guests continued to glance at us. Some recognized Dante immediately. Others knew only from the behavior of those who did. Fear traveled faster than introductions. The toast began after the first course. Nathan S., best man, told a story about law school that was not funny but received laughter from people who wanted to remain invited to things. Vanessa S., maid of honor, cried into a speech about destiny, which made my sister dab her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I watched her and wondered how long she had practiced looking innocent in white. Then my mother stood. My stomach tightened. Margaret lifted her glass, elegant and composed again. Before we continue, I would like to acknowledge someone very important who joined us today. Her eyes found mine. Evelyn, sweetheart, I know this day may not be easy, but family is about grace. Perhaps you'd like to say a few words for the bride and groom. The room went still. It was a trap, a beautiful, maternal, socially acceptable trap. If I refused, I was bitter. If I cried, I was unstable. If I spoke too sharply, I ruined the wedding. If I offered blessings, I helped them bury me with manners. For a second, the old Evelyn almost rose, so the one trained to smooth the tablecloth, after someone else spilled wine, the one who would rather bleed quietly than make people uncomfortable. Then Dante's voice came from beside me. So low, only I could hear. Only if you choose, that was all. I stood. The chair made a soft sound against the floor. Every face turned toward me. Nathan looked wary. Vanessa looked terrified. My mother looked relieved, which told me she still believed she could predict me. I picked up my champagne glass to my sister, I said, and my former fiancé. A whisper moved through the room. I continued, my voice steady. May your marriage be as honest as the way it began. The silence sharpened. Nathan's face went white around the mouth. Vanessa stared at me as if I had slapped her without moving. I looked across the room, not rushing, not shaking. And may everyone here remember that silence is not always approval. Sometimes it is the last kindness we offer before the truth arrives. No one breathed. I raised my glass slightly to the happy couple, then I sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a few confused guests lifted their glasses. Others did not. My mother looked like she might faint. Vanessa's hand trembled around her champagne flute. Nathan leaned toward her, whispering something I could not hear. Tay lifted his glass by an inch, not a toast, recognition. The reception tried to continue after that, but the room had changed. Conversation returned in pieces, quieter than before. People smiled with their mouths and watched with their eyes. I had not told them everything. That was what made it worse for them. Truth, when only partly revealed, makes guilty people fill in the rest themselves. I had just taken my first sip of water when a man approached our table. He was tall, silver-haired, and polished in the way old predators often were. His tuxedo fit perfectly, his smile belonged on a donor wall. I knew his face from the photograph Dante had shown me. Richard Vale, Dante, he said warmly. Too warmly. I didn't know you attended family weddings. Dante looked up at him. I attend as many things, he said, when the guest list interests me. Richard's smile held, but his hand tightened around his glass. I saw it, just 1 second, one crack, and in that crack I understood something with sudden certainty. Dante Moretti did not come to this wedding only because of me. And Richard Vale had just realized it, too. Richard Vale stood beside our table, with the kind of smile men wear when they have spent a lifetime being welcomed into rooms they should have been investigated in. He was older than Nathan by at least 20 years, silver-haired, polished, and perfectly still. Everything about him looked expensive but not loud. His tuxedo fit like it had never known a department store hanger. His cufflinks caught the candlelight. His eyes did not. They were cold, pale, and careful. The eyes of a man who listened for weakness the way other people listened for music. Dante did not rise to greet him. That was the first small insult. Richard noticed. Of course he did. Men like him collected insults the way bankers collect signatures. But he only smiled wider and lifted his champagne glass. Dante, he said, Chicago must be more interesting than I realized if it brought you to a family wedding. Dante leaned back in his chair, calm enough to make the room go colder. The guest list interested me. Richard's gaze moved to me. Slowly enough to be rude, not quickly enough to be polite. He studied me the way a buyer studies property. Condition, use, value, risk. Miss Hart, he said, I don't believe we've met. No, I said, we haven't tea, but I know your work. The Ashbury restoration, the Walker townhouse, beautiful projects. I smiled because women are taught to smile when men say things that sound like compliments but feel like inventory. That's generous of you. Not generous. Accurate. His eyes flicked toward Nathan at the head table. Nathan has spoken very highly of you. A strange quiet moved through me. Nathan had spoken highly of me to Richard Vale. The sentence should have been harmless. It was not. I remembered Daunt's words from the day before. Women are signatures, inheritances, and doors. I looked across the reception hall at Nathan, who was leaning close to Vanessa, saying something into her ear while she stared down at her untouched champagne. I turned back to Richard. That's interesting. Nathan and I haven't had many kind conversations lately. Richard's smile did not move. Weddings are complicated. No, Dante said. Contracts are complicated. Betrayal is usually simple. For the first time, Richard's expression shifted only a fraction. But I saw it a small tightening beneath the left eye. I had built a career noticing what rooms tried to hide: uneven floors, covered cracks, fresh paint over water damage. People were not so different, they all revealed pressure somewhere. Richard looked back at Dant, still dramatic. "I see, still alive," Dant said. The words landed softly, too softly. Richard, in hand, tightened around his glass. I understood then that their history was not business. Not entirely. There was blood in it. Old blood. Buried blood. The kind men with money pay other men to forget. Richard excused himself a moment later with perfect manners, but as he walked away, the air around our table did not immediately return to normal. Dante watched him cross the room, his face unreadable. I waited for him to explain. He did not. So I asked, "What was that?" Dante's eyes stayed on Richard. "A man pretending not to recognize the edge of a cliff, and you brought me here to watch him fall?" That made Dante look at me. "No, I brought you here because you chose to come." "Dante, do that." "Do what?" "Answer like a priest when you read clearly holding a knife behind your back." For a second, I thought I had gone too far. Then Dante's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to be dangerous. "Notice more when you re-angry," he said. "So she notice a plenty when I am calm." "Yes," he said. "That is why I need to show you something before Nathan decides how much truth this room can survive." He stood, not abruptly. Nothing Dante did was abrupt. He simply rose, and the two men standing near the far wall shifted without looking like they had. I hated that I was beginning to notice the choreography around him. People adjusted before he moved, as if the room itself had learned his habits. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To the library." "This estate has a library?" "People with too much money enjoy rooms that imply they read." I should not have laughed. I almost did anyway. The library was tucked behind the main hall, separated from the reception by a paneled corridor and a pair of dark wooden doors. Inside, the music became a distant, expensive hum. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, most of the books bound in leather and arranged too neatly to have ever been loved. A fire burned low in the marble fireplace, even though the room was warm. On the long table in the center, a cream folder waited. My stomach tightened before I touched it. Daunt closed the door behind us but did not lock it. That mattered, I noticed. He noticed that. "I noticed the choice remains yours," he said. I looked at the folder. "What is this?" "Proof that Nathan stole from you before he stood beside your sister." For a moment I could not move. Then I opened the folder. The first page was an email chain. Nathan's name: Richard Vale S. assistant. Development company I had never heard of. Attached documents, property summaries, restoration estimates. My eyes moved faster as I read, catching words that belonged to my world and numbers that did not. Hart Family Holdings, lakefront parcels, easement agreements, historic conversion rights. Then I saw my name, not mentioned, used. My professional letterhead appeared on the next page. Evelyn Hart Design Group. Old signature at the bottom. A scanned authorization approving design feasibility for a property transfer I had never reviewed. I turned the page. Another signature. Then another. My fingers went cold. "These are fake," I said. "Yes. I didn't assign these. I know." The room tilted slightly. I put one hand on the table, not because I was weak, because the floor needed a witness. Nathan had not only left me for Vanessa, he had gone back into the years when I trusted him, pulled pieces of my professional life from old files, and used them to make something illegal look clean. He had taken my name, my work, my reputation, and attached them to Richard Vale S. Money, like I was a stamp on an envelope. "He used my signature," I said. Dante stood across from me, still as stone. "He used your trust. That is worse." The words hit so hard I had to close my eyes because that was exactly it. The papers were not the deepest violation. The deepest violation was that Nathan had reached backward into a version of me who still loved him. A version who left her laptop open around him. A version who forwarded files because she thought they were building a life together. A version who believed privacy was unnecessary between two people planning to share a future. That woman had trusted him. He had robbed her, too. I opened my eyes and kept reading. The documents connected my supposed approvals to a shell company tied to Richard Vale. Another page showed property values. Another showed projected profits after rezoning. Another showed Vanessa S. inheritance structure after marriage. My sister S. name appeared there too, circled in red ink. Vanessa does to know, I said. No, Nathan is using her. Yes, I wanted that to make me feel better. It did not. Vanessa had still chosen to hurt me. Being used did not erase what she had done, but it changed the shape of the room. She was not the queen in Nathan's game. She was another piece on the board, painted white and placed where Richard wanted her. My anger rose so fast it frightened me. I grabbed the folder and turned toward the door. Dante's voice stopped me. If you confront him angry, he will call you unstable. I froze. He will say grief made you reckless, Dante continued. He will say you forged the documents to punish him. He will let the room look at your dress, your face, your history with him, and decide you are emotional before they decide he is guilty. I hated him for being right. The old Evelyn wanted to walk into that reception and throw the papers in Nathan's face. She wanted to point at Vanessa, at my mother, at every guest who had smiled at me, like my pain was a scheduling inconvenience. She wanted noise. For once, she wanted noise. But the woman standing in that library knew better. Noise would feed them, proof would trap them. I set the folder back on the table. My hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from restraint. What do? I asked. Dante's face softened by one almost invisible degree. You breathe, you return to the table, you let him believe he still controls the story, and then we choose the moment he cannot escape. I looked at the papers again. My name on lies, my signature under theft, my trust turned into evidence. Why didn't you tell me before we came? Because you had already been given enough pain before walking through the door. That wasn't your decision to make. No, he said. It was. The apology was not spoken, but it was there, more than Nathan had ever given me, more than my mother had managed. Dante did not defend himself. He simply accepted the truth when it was handed to him. That made me angrier for a moment, then less angry after that. I picked up the top page again. Can this ruin me? If handled badly, yes. And if handled well, then it ruins him. I looked toward the closed doors, toward the muffled music, toward the room where my ex-husband, to someone else, was probably smiling over champagne, believing I had only come to be wounded in public. I straightened the papers, placed them back into the folder, and closed it. When Dante and I returned to the reception, I did not look at Nathan right away. I sat down. I placed my napkin across my lap. I lifted my water glass with a steady hand. Across the room, Nathan glanced at me and smiled. He thought I knew nothing. For the first time all day, I smiled back. For the next 20 minutes, I sat at that reception table with my hands folded in my lap and my heart beating like it knew something my face refused to admit. Nathan kept looking at me from the head table, not constantly. He was too polished for that. He smiled at guests, touched Vanessa's hand, laughed when someone leaned in to congratulate him. But every few minutes his eyes found mine, and each time I saw the same question hiding behind them. What do you know? Vanessa noticed too. At first, she tried to ignore it. She smiled brighter. She leaned closer to him. She lifted her champagne glass and laughed at things that were not funny. My sister had always been good at performing happiness when people were watching. But performance is exhausting when the person beside you is watching someone else. I saw the first crack when Nathan excused himself from the head table. Richard Vale had already disappeared through the side corridor, and Nathan followed him less than a minute later. Vanessa watched them go. Her smile stayed in place, but her eyes changed. For the first time that day, she looked less like a bride and more like a woman realizing she might not understand the ceremony she was standing inside. I should have looked away. I didn't. Vanessa rose from her chair and followed them. Dante noticed without turning his head. Your sister is about to learn something. I looked down at my water glass. Good. The word came out colder than I expected. Dante did not judge it. Pain often feels like justice when it first was. I hated how gently he said that, because it made me hear myself more clearly. I wanted Vanessa to hurt. Of course I did. I wanted her to feel one honest fraction of what she had helped do to me. Wanting someone to hurt and watching it happen are not the same thing, especially when the person is your sister. Betrayal does not erase history, it only poisons it. A few minutes later, I stood. Dante did not ask where I was going. He only said, "Do not walk into a room where you are outnumbered." I looked at him. I am only going to find my sister. That is not always safer. He was right. Family rooms can be more dangerous than rooms full of strangers. Still, I went. I found Vanessa in the hallway outside a half-open sitting room. She stood frozen near the door, one hand pressed to her stomach, her veil falling loose over one shoulder. Inside the room, Nathan's voice was low but clear. Once the marriage is finalized publicly, Margaret won't fight the transfer. Vanessa signs where I tell her to sign. Trusts me, Richard answered. She trusts being chosen. That is easier to use. Nathan gave a short laugh. Evelyn would have read every page. And that, Richard said, is why you married the right sister. Vanessa made a sound so small I almost missed it. It was not a sob. It was the sound of a person dropping something inside herself and hearing it break. Nathan stepped into the hallway a second later and saw us both. For once, he had no smile ready. Vanessa, he said. She stared at him. Is that why? He adjusted his cuff. I knew that gesture. He used it when buying time. You misunderstood. No. Her voice shook. I heard you. Richard appeared behind him, calm as ever. This is not the place for emotion. That was when Vanessa looked at him, really looked at him, and understood she had not been a bride in their eyes. She'd been in a doorway. Nathan reached for her arm. Come on, don't do this here. She pulled away. Why did you marry me? His face hardened. Not much. Just enough of Vanessa. You wanted to be chosen. I chose you, don't. Start asking questions. You want to like the answers to there it was. Not shouted, not dramatic. Just the naked truth. Ugly because it was simple. Vanessa turned toward me then. Her face was pale beneath the makeup, her eyes wide and wet. For the first time in my life, my sister looked at me without competition in her eyes. Did he ever love you? She asked. I could have wounded her, with the answer part of me wanted to. Instead, I told the truth. Maybe in the way men like Nathan love things they can use. He loved my work when it opened doors. He loved my loyalty when it made his life easier. He loved my name when he needed something clean to put on dirty paper. Vanessa covered her mouth. Nathan snapped, Evelyn, enough. I looked at him. No. Enough was when you left me. This is something else. My mother appeared at the end of the hall, breathless, frightened by the sight of us together, more than by whatever had caused it. What is going on? Vanessa laughed once, broken and bitter. You got what you wanted, Mom. I was chosen. Margaret looked from Vanessa to me. Girls, please. Not here. I turned to her slowly. That has always been your answer, hasn't it? Not here. Not now. Not while Vanessa is upset. Not while Nathan is uncomfortable. Not while the family is watching. Her eyes filled with tears. I was trying to keep this family together. No, I said. You were trying to keep a version of this family where I paid the price for everyone else's comfort. No one spoke after that. The reception hall, music continued to play softly, as if the house itself had not noticed the truth standing in the corridor. Vanessa looked down at her wedding ring. For the first time, she seemed to understand that winning something stolen does not make it yours. It only makes you responsible for the theft. Nathan moved first. That was how I knew he was afraid. Not guilty, not sorry, afraid. He stepped toward Vanessa, as if he could still fold her back into the story he had written. As if a hand on her elbow and a softened voice could make her forget what she had heard. But Vanessa moved away from him, and the small space between them looked bigger than the hallway itself. Vanessa, he said carefully, you re-emotional. This is exactly why I didn't want to discuss business today. I almost laughed. Business. That was what he called it now. Not betrayal, not fraud, not marrying my sister for access to my family's holdings. Business. Vanessa stared at him like she was seeing his face after years of looking only at the version she wanted. You married me this morning, she whispered. You let me stand in that room thinking this was love. Nathan's jaw tightened. It can still be love and strategy. That sentence did something to me. It cleared the last fog from the room. No, I said. Love does not need a shell company. Nathan turned on me so fast my mother flinched. You need to be very careful, Evelyn. There it was. The voice he used when politeness failed. The voice beneath the charm. The voice that had probably been there all along, waiting for the day I stopped being useful. He stepped closer, lowering his tone so only those of us in the hallway could hear. If you try to make a scene, I will tell everyone you forged those documents because you couldn't handle being left. I'll say grief made you unstable. I'll say, you came here with a criminal because you wanted revenge. And who do you think they'll believe? The groom on his wedding day, or the bitter woman he didn't marry? For 1 second, the old fear touched me. Not because Nathan could lie. I already knew he could. But because part of me still remembered how easily people believed a calm man over a wounded woman. Dante stepped forward. I lifted one hand. He stopped. That was when I understood the difference between protection and control. Dante could have ended the conversation with a word, maybe with less than a word, but he let me decide whether I still had a voice. I looked at Nathan and said, "You still think I came here to be believed? I didn't. I came with proof." His eyes flickered. Dante opened the library door behind us. One of his men stood inside, holding the cream folder. He handed it to me without a word. I took it and walked back into the reception hall. The music was still playing. Guests were still pretending nothing was wrong. White candles floated in glass bowls. Champagne still sparkled under the chandeliers. It's almost beautiful, how hard money worked to keep ugliness hidden. I walked to the center of the room and placed the folder on the nearest table. Nathan followed me. Vanessa followed him. My mother came after us with one hand pressed to her chest. Richard Vale entered last, his face smooth, but his eyes colder than before. I opened the folder. "This," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me, "is my signature on documents I never signed. These are project approvals I never gave. These are transfers connected to a company I never worked with. And these are access records showing when those file stores were created, edited, and sent." Whispers moved across the room. Nathan smiled too late. "Evelyn, this is sad." "No," I said. "Sad was finding out you married my sister." It was criminal." The smile vanished. Richard Vale spoke then, low and polished. "You should think carefully before making accusations you cannot understand." Dante's voice came from beside me. "She understands enough." The room changed when he spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough for every powerful man present to remember why they feared him. Richard looked at Dante. "Are you planning to handle this here?" Dante's face remained calm. "No. Men like you expect violence. That is why prison frightens you more." At that exact moment, the front doors opened. Federal agents entered first, followed by two financial investigators and a woman in a gray suit carrying a warrant. The string quartet stopped mid-note. A champagne flute hit the floor somewhere behind me. "No," Bahideen screamed. Somehow, that made it worse. The woman in gray approached Richard Vale and read his name like it had already been removed from every building he owned. Nathan tried to speak to one of the agents, then stopped when another investigator held up a copy of the same documents I had in my folder. Vanessa stood frozen in her wedding dress, no longer a bride, no longer a winner. Only a woman realizing the altar had been another kind of contract. My mother sank into the nearest chair. Richard looked at Dawn with hatred, so old it almost looked like grief. "You think this ends anything?" Dawn did not move. "No. But it begins the part where you stop buying silence." Nathan was taken aside for questioning. Richard was escorted out past the white roses, past the candles, past the guests who suddenly remembered urgent reasons not to know him. When the doors closed behind them, the room was not peaceful, it was exposed. Dante turned to me. "Does it feel like revenge?" I looked at the ruined wedding, my shaking sister, my silent mother, the folder with my stolen name inside it. "No," I said. "It feels like the truth finally stopped asking for permission." By the time I got home, the sun had already gone down, but I did not turn on the lights. I stepped out of my heels in the entryway and left them there. One fallen on its side, the other still upright, like it had not yet understood. The day was over. The blackness that had carried me through that room suddenly felt too tight, too heavy, too full of everyone's eyes. I reached behind me, unzipped it halfway, and stood in the dark apartment with my hand against the wall, breathing like I had just escaped something burning. People think truth feels like freedom. The moment it comes out, it doesn't at least, it didn't for me. Truth opened the door. That was all. I still had to walk through it. I still had to live in the quiet. After the shouting stopped, after the agents left, after the whispers followed Richard Vale and Nathan out of the estate like smoke. I'd imagined that if the truth ever came, I would feel powerful. Instead, I felt empty in a clean, frightening way, like a room after all the furniture has been carried out. My phone had been buzzing since I left the wedding. Reporters, relatives, people who had ignored my pain when it was private and now found it fascinating because it had become public. I turned the phone face down on the kitchen counter and sat on the floor with my back against the cabinets. The invitation was still on the table where I had left it days ago. Nathan and Vanessa's names still shone in gold, but they looked different now. Smaller. Not harmless, but exposed. I did not cry until I noticed the scarf. The blue silk scarf Sophia had returned to me was folded on the edge of the table. That was what broke me. Not Nathan, not Vanessa, not my mother's silence. A child's scarf, washed carefully and given back with both hands. I picked it up and pressed it to my mouth, and then the tears came so suddenly I had no time to be graceful about them. I cried for the woman who had loved Nathan honestly. I cried for the sister I had protected before she learned how to use that protection against me. I cried for the daughter who had spent 32 years mistaking being needed for being loved. And somewhere under all of that, I cried because I was tired. So tired of being strong in ways that only made other people comfortable. 3 days passed before my mother came. She knocked softly, which was not like her. Margaret Hart usually entered rooms as if motherhood were a key that still opened every door. When I let her in, she looked older than she had at the wedding. No perfect hair, no careful lipstick, just a woman standing in her daughter's apartment, finally unsure of her place there. "I didn't know how to call you," she said. "That never stopped you before." She flinched, and I hated that part of me still wanted to comfort her. "I thought you didn't need me," she whispered. I looked at her for a long time. That sentence was the closest thing to an apology my mother knew how to give, but it was not enough to heal what it named. "I did need you," I said. "You just liked being needed by Vanessa more." Her eyes filled. "Evelyn, no," I said gently but firmly. "Please don't make me soften this for you. I've done that my whole life." She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wedding invitation like it belonged to someone else. "I thought if I protected Vanessa, I was keeping the family together. You weren't protecting the family. Protecting the version of it where I could be hurt and still come back." That time she had no answer. I did not ask her to leave. I did not hug her either. We sat in the same room, and for once I let the silence belong to her. Later that evening, a letter arrived from Vanessa. No perfume, no dramatic apology. Just 3 pages in her uneven handwriting, she wrote that she had mistaken being chosen for being loved. She wrote that seeing Nathan clearly felt like waking up in a house she had helped set on fire. She wrote, "I thought taking what you had would prove I mattered. It only proved I never learned how to choose myself." I folded the letter carefully. I did not throw it away. But I did not answer. That night, Dantain called. I let it ring twice before picking up Miss Hart, he said. Mr. Morta paused, then he asked, "Have you eaten?" For some reason that almost made me cry again. Not because the question was grand, because it was simple human, the kind of care no one had thought to offer when they were all asking whether I would behave. "No," I admitted. "Then start there," he said. And for the first time, in a long time, I did. 1 month later, I stood inside an unfinished building in New York, with dust on my shoes and sunlight spilling across the bare wooden floor. There were no white roses here, no champagne, no wedding music, no guests whispering behind raised glasses, just open walls, exposed beams, the smell of fresh lumber, and the quiet promise of a place that had not yet decided what it wanted to become. I liked unfinished spaces. They were honest. They did not pretend to be whole before the work was done. Dante stood a few feet away from me, his black coat open, his hands in his pockets, watching me study the room. He had bought the building through one of his foundations, though he refused to say the word gift. I refused to say repayment. We both understood this was something else. A month after Nathan's arrest and Richard Vale's downfall, Dante had asked if I would design a recovery center for children who had lost parents to violence, not a hospital, not a shelter, a place for breathing again, a place for learning that fear did not have to be permanent. Sophia's name was not on the front of the project, but she was everywhere in it, in the wide windows, in the quiet reading rooms. In the small indoor garden. I had sketched near the center of the building, where children could sit without being watched too closely. I had learned something from her in that elevator. Children do not always need adults to be fearless. Sometimes they just need one person willing to admit the dark is real and stay anyway. Daunt walked beside me as I moved through what would become the main hall. "What will this place become?" he asked. I looked around at the unfinished walls, the dust floating in the light, the future waiting for color. "A place where children don't have to act strong to be loved," I said. He did not answer right away. He rarely did when something mattered. His silence was different now, though. Less like a locked door, more like a man standing in front of one, deciding whether he trusted himself to open it. "That is a difficult thing to build," he said. "So are most things worth saving." He looked at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw the grief in his face without the armor around it. Not all of it. Men like Dante did not hand over pain easily. But enough. Enough to remind me that power did not protect anyone from loss. It only gave them better walls to hide behind. That evening, I attended a charity gala in Manhattan. I almost refused the invitation. Not because I was afraid, but because part of me was tired of rooms where everyone measured everyone else before saying hello. But this time was different. I was not walking in as Nathan's abandoned fiancée. I was not walking in as Vanessa's betrayed sister. I was not walking in to prove I had survived. I was simply walking in. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, black tuxedos, jewel-toned gowns, and the soft hum of people who knew how to make money sound like virtue. For a second, standing at the entrance, I remembered the wedding, the silence, the staring, the weight of Dantes' arm beneath my hand. Then I realized I was not shaking across the room. Sophia saw me first. She broke away from a woman I recognized as her nanny and ran straight toward me, her dark hair bouncing behind her. I bent down just in time for her to throw her arms around my neck. "You came," she said. I smiled into her hair. I did. When I looked up, Dante was watching us from near the head table. There were powerful people waiting for him there, senators, donors, men with clean smiles and dirty histories, but he was not looking at them. He was looking at his daughter's arms around me, as if the sight frightened and healed him at the same time. He came over slowly. "Miss Hart," he said. Mr. Moretti. Sophia rolled her eyes. "You both sound like old newspapers." That made me laugh. A real laugh, small, but mine. Dante looked at the table behind him, then back at me. "Would you like to sit with us?" Once, that question would have undone me. I had spent too much of my life waiting to be chosen by my mother, by Nathan, by a family that only loved me easily when I made myself useful. But I was learning. Being invited was not the same as belonging. And belonging meant very little if I had to abandon myself to keep the seat. I looked at Dante and smiled. "Only if I choose my own seat." Something warm moved through his eyes. "Expected nothing less," he said. Later that night, as the music rose and Sophia leaned sleepily against her father's side, I looked out over the ballroom and thought of the wedding invitation still tucked in a drawer back in Chicago. They had thought I would stay home because it made the story easier for them to tell. The bitter sex, the difficult sister, the quiet daughter who swallowed one more humiliation for the sake of family. But I had gone. Not to ruin their wedding, not to steal the spotlight, not even to prove I was unbroken. I went because one day, every woman has to decide whether she will keep disappearing to protect people who never protected her. That day, I stopped disappearing, and for the first time in my life, I did not come home broken. I came home mine. Story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
This story is not only about a woman walking into her ex-fiance's wedding with a powerful mafia boss beside her. At its heart, this is a story about dignity, self-respect, and the moment a person finally decides to stop disappearing for people who never protected them. Evelyn's pain is not just romantic betrayal. Her deepest wound comes from being expected to stay silent. Her ex betrayed her. Her sister replaced her. Her mother knew the truth and still asked her to stay home, not because it would heal Evelyn, but because it would make everyone else more comfortable. That is one of the hardest lessons in life. Sometimes people do not ask for your silence because they love peace. They ask for your silence because your truth exposes their guilt. Dante Moretti represents power, but not in the loud, violent way people expect. His true power is discipline, loyalty, and control. He does not stand beside Evelyn to own her or rescue her like a helpless woman. He stands beside her because she once protected his daughter when no one was watching. In his world, loyalty matters. Debt matters. Respect matters. That is what makes him different from Nathan, a man who uses love, marriage, and trust as tools for ambition. The moral lesson is clear. Being strong does not mean accepting pain quietly. Being kind does not mean allowing people to use you. And forgiveness should never require you to return to the same place where you were broken. Evelyn wins not because she becomes cruel, but because she remains composed. She gathers truth. She keeps her dignity. She lets evidence speak louder than anger. That is real strength. The story teaches us that the most powerful revenge is not destruction. It is becoming impossible to erase. It is walking into the room they hoped you would never enter, lifting your head, and choosing yourself at last.